First of all, before we start, what do your friends call you? Do they call you Leonard? Do they call you Charlamagne? Do they call you C at the G? What do they call
Yeah,
you?
Leonard. I mean, it's a combination. Like it's a lot.
Leonard, not Leonard.
Yeah,
Leonard.
yeah, Leonard. Charla. It was between Leonard and Charla.
Charla. I like that. And how did you get the name Charlemagne the God?
Well, when I was younger and I was doing things I had no business doing in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, like selling crack, I used to
Mm-hmm.
always, I used to have an alias, and my alias was Charles because like I come from a really small town, and so like the people that would pull up to buy drugs from me, even though they were buying the drugs, they would still go and tell my parents, right? So I would always have like a hoodie on, and I would say my name is Charles or Charlie. And then I was in night school one day, and I was reading in a history book, and I saw the name Charlemagne, and it was French for Charles the Great. And then I also read about this Haitian general whose name was Charlemagne, and I just thought it was a cool name. I was like, you know what? That's a cool name. That's gonna look good on the front cover of a book one day. And I've had 3 New York Times bestsellers, national bestsellers. So
Well, I was going to
yeah,
say you have come a long way from selling crack on the corner in South Carolina. And now,
right.
you're interviewing a presidential candidate. They say this is the first podcast election, and that seems to be true. And obviously, Vice President Harris wanted to talk to you and to be on the Breakfast Club. How did the interview come about? Did she reach out to you or did you reach out to her?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been interviewing the vice president on Breakfast Club since 2018. I had her when she was a senator. She came on the Breakfast Club back in 2018. We got a great hour-long conversation that you can go watch on YouTube. When she ran for president in 2020, she came back to the Breakfast Club. I had a late night talk show on Comedy Central a couple of years ago. She was a guest on that when she was a vice president. So it's almost like at every iteration of her career since about 2018, I've been there. Like I said, I interviewed her when she was a senator, interviewed her when she was running for president, interviewed her when she was vice president, and now I'm interviewing her again while she runs for president. And even in 2020, I was out there on the campaign trail with her too. Like we was in South Carolina together. She unveiled her mental health initiative in Somerville, South Carolina. I was with her there. I was with her at South Carolina State University. I was with her in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was with her in Brooklyn. So yeah, we've developed a pretty good rapport over the
I
last
was going to
several years.
say, you sound so you really know her quite well. Would you say your friends or acquaintances? How would you describe your relationship?
Um, Man, that's a strong. Those words are strong, right? But I would consider her. I would consider her a friend. Her and her sister Maya. Like, yeah, I would definitely consider them people that I would call friends. And I mean, that's what I really appreciate about her more than anything. I appreciate her heart. I saw President Obama said something about a week or two ago, and those comments got lost, and him scolding black men for no reason, by the way, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, we'll
But there,
talk about that with Astead.
okay, there was another thing that he said where he said that the other excuse he hears is that people feel like politicians aren't going to do anything for them. And he said to that, I say, you're right. We're not going to eliminate poverty. We're not going to, get rid of racism, throughout the world. But you should vote for the people who care and who can make your world a little bit better. I thought that was just a very honest statement, and I think that's showing a lot of empathy to how voters feel. So I think she's a person who cares. I think she's one of those individuals who just simply cares.
So much focus, as you know, has been on her declining support among black men, particularly black men under the age of 50. So if you had to tell people listening in a nutshell, what would you say to this question? What is going on with Kamala Harris and young black dudes?
I think well, two things. I think number one, it's unfair to say it's black men in Kamala Harris. I think that it is black people in the Democratic Party, period. This is something that's been, it's been a conversation since 2016. A lot of black people feel like the Democratic Party hasn't delivered for them. And I think I think it's just a matter of um, not the fact that people have something against Kamala Harris. It's just how people feel about the Democratic Party as a whole. But even with that said, I think everybody's freaking out for no reason. I think it's all overstated when they say they're losing support because I have nothing to show me that yet. These are just all polls and speculation. In 2016, 85% of black men voted for Hillary Clinton. In 2020, I think like 90% of black men I know it was definitely over 80% voted for President Biden, and Vice President Harris was on the ticket. I'm a person that only voted for that ticket because of Vice President Harris. So I just think that when people say things like, "Oh, black men, they don't want to support the vice president," I just think that's overstated. I don't believe that. I have to come November, I could be proven wrong, but I just don't believe it, because I mean, since Reagan, if I'm not mistaken, black people have voted conservative between 8% and 15%. Like, Trump got 12% of the black male, either the black vote or the black male vote in 2020. I think it was the black vote as a whole. Maybe so it might have been like, I don't remember what the exact number. I think it was 12%. But so it's like those numbers aren't far off from the average. Like, there are black conservatives out here. Like, it just is. So it's like that number isn't far off from the average. I think you said something else earlier that made me remember one of my points that I kind of forgot a little bit. But it's like, it's not that people are necessarily wanting to go be conservative. They're just off everything. They're not feeling the political process, period. They're not feeling Democrats. They're not feeling Republicans. There's a lot of black people who feel like, regardless of who's in office, our communities don't change. Things are still the same. You got somebody like President Obama who promised a lot of hope and a lot of change, but that didn't change anything, right? So I think the vice president is fighting against a lot of that, right? A lot of people feeling like, oh, we've had that before. We had a black face in a high place before, and I feel like she's fighting against how people feel about the Democratic Party.
How did you find her in your interview? Did you think that she answered the questions? Did you feel that she was direct, authentic, and you know her? So how did you feel about this last go round when you guys talked?
Well, in my new book, Get Out of the Die Line, Why Small Talk Sucks, I have a chapter called The Language of Politics is Dead. And so I credit Donald Trump with killing the language of politics. So I feel like politicians can speak very freely if they choose to. Plus, I'm a big fan of the movie Bulworth. So
I love that.
So I've been waiting for a politician to sound like Senator Bulworth. But I think she said something in the beginning of our conversation when I brought up the fact that people say she's very scripted. People say she sticks to her talking points. She said, "You're welcome." I call that discipline. And it made me think about something. I think that we've seen such a lack of discipline since Donald Trump came on the scene that we forgot what that looks like. So when you have a politician who is in an interview or in a conversation and they're being disciplined, as she says, and getting their message across and telling us what their policies are and, detailing their policies, it's kind of like we want to be entertained, right? And that's not what I think we need from our politicians. So to say, do I think she was being authentic? Yeah, I think she was being authentically who she is, which is a very disciplined, seasoned, veteran politician.
I have to beg to differ with you on that point. I think that she takes a really long time to get to her point, and that she does rely on talking points too often. I think she's gotten much better than she used to, but it's almost as if she's afraid to say something that will later come back to haunt her. And I find the fact that she just doesn't really articulate to me her true policy position, and that she isn't really directly answering the questions a lot of times. That's been my experience, and my experience watching her. I just wish she would say, "This is our plan," or "You're right, a lot of illegal immigrants have come into this country during the Biden administration, but this is why, and this is what I want to do about it moving forward." I don't find her explanation of policy that compelling compared to, say, someone like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. Have you ever interviewed them?
Yeah, I interviewed President Obama before. I interviewed President Obama when his book came out. So I've never interviewed President Obama when he was running for office. I've interviewed, Hillary Clinton a couple of times as well when she was running. Um, I, I can understand what you're saying. I think that, a lot of politicians, or at least disciplined ones, are scared of saying things that, may come back to haunt them. But my thing is, in 2024, what can truly come back to haunt you? But then again, there's only one Donald Trump. Nothing seems to haunt Donald Trump. Nothing seems to stick to Donald Trump, but everything seems to stick, to everybody else. But
How do you
I do
explain that? How do you explain that? I think a lot of people are
media.
left
I
media.
think I really truly believe it's the media's fault because we created this double standard. Like not just the media, government. Because people will say things like Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, but as I told the vice president, I don't feel like the administration acted like it. Like Merrick Garland could have, arrested Donald Trump a long time ago for leading an attempted coup in this country, but he chose not to. So now, when you choose not to, you get Donald Trump at dinners telling jokes. So it doesn't even look like he's a guy that has 90 plus criminal charges, who's been convicted of 30, 34 of them already, or whatever the number was. You don't even look at him as, you know, what he actually is, which is a true threat to our democracy. Like, I was reading something in the New York Times the other day, and it said how this election is a moment of truth for Donald Trump. And they just laid out every single thing he's ever been accused of in life. This guy should have been disqualified from running for president a long, 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 long time ago. And if Kamala Harris or President Obama or a Bill Clinton back in the day, if any of those people had said one of the things that Donald Trump has said or done one of the things Donald Trump has done, they'd be disqualified already.
Well, we're going to bring in Astead Herndon, who is the national politics reporter and the host of the politics podcast, The Run Up. And 2019, Estelle was the Times campaign reporter for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. He's interviewed her as well. He's got a kind of a famous interview with Kamala Harris that he'll be here to talk about. Hi, Astead. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. I really appreciate being here and y'all hearing us out.
Well, we were just talking, Charla and I were just talking. You can call him Charla if you're good friends. And we were saying that nothing, as you overheard, because you joined us in the middle of it, seems to affect Donald Trump. I think the word Teflon presidency was first came to be talking about Ronald Reagan, I believe.
Yeah.
And now I'm not sure what's stronger than Teflon, and I guess Teflon is now considered a dangerous substance, but I don't know what it is about Donald Trump that nothing sticks, no matter what he does. Astead, what do you think is the reason for that? That people are willing to forgive so many past things?
Yeah, I mean, I think to what, Charlamagne just said, I agree that if half the things that Donald Trump has said or done, 1% of the things Donald Trump has said or done had been, was true about the Democratic candidate or even most other Republicans, you would see them pretty clearly disqualified from the jump. I mean, I think we know some of the answers to this. Like, there is a different type of relationship with supporter that he fosters. I think it's important to see Trump as a more movement candidate than a particularly party figure, because his voters feel as if they know and can interpret what he believes more so than mainstream media, more so than the things that they hear and read. They're willing to dismiss stuff that doesn't fit within that overall picture. But I guess I'm not someone who thinks that this stuff hasn't affected Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the second most unpopular presidential candidate who's ever run. He just happens to have been running for people. He happens to be running against people who were just as unpopular as him, particularly in 2016, I think, and much of this race against Joe Biden. In fact, I frankly would go even further and say if the Democratic Party had kind of followed through on the plan they implied in 2020, where Biden didn't run, they held a primary, worked out some of their kind of internal ideological shifts, and then produced a nominee, even if that nominee was still Kamala Harris, I think that person would have been in a much stronger position than they currently find themselves, because I don't think Donald Trump actually is all that massively popular. I think Donald Trump has a hard ceiling of popularity that is greater than most other politicians. But what we know is that the anti-Trump coalition is one that is just as strong, if not stronger. We saw that in the midterms. We've seen that in special elections. We see that kind of over and over. And frankly, it's what gives Democrats some confidence, even as this looks really 50-50. So I guess I would take the other side and say, I don't think that Donald Trump is fully Teflon. I think that a lot of the things that have been hurt, a lot of the things are just priced in for most people. So they see him as untrustworthy. They see him as someone who will flout rules and norms. But I think for a lot of people, that's being held up against a desire for change that he can also represent when Democrats have feel a little more status quo, which I do think they do feel now. And part of that is part of the process question. Like, I don't think it was inherent that Kamala Harris felt like that. I think there was a version of that that did feel like a big new way forward. Some ways I think that this process has played out has hurt their ability to cast themselves as that.
Well, let's talk about this whole idea of having a more open primary, given that there were only a few months between the time Joe Biden stepped down or decided not to run and the election itself. I mean, do you think, I mean, it's great to say that in hindsight, right, Astead? And I'd love to hear what Charlamagne says about this as well. But do you really think it would have put the Democrats in a stronger position? I mean, that's sort of a fantasy, isn't it?
I hear why you're saying that, but I was there in early 2023 asking them these same questions about Biden's age. It was only the evidence was there that the public thought he was too old for a second term. The donor money was there for interest in the open and other candidates. It was their own deference to Joe Biden that put them in this position. That's the only thing that put them in this position, is their traditional deference to his re-election. So I'm really talking about early 2023.
Oh, you're saying it. You're saying if he had dropped out a year earlier.
I'm saying if he would have followed through on what he implied to the public in 2020, which is that he would be a transitional president and lead to another generation of Democrats, they wouldn't be in this position. I think a lot of their voters assumed that they wouldn't be in this position and that the party would have a new conversation with itself in an open primary way. But that's obviously not how it developed. He ran and folks stuck by him for a year and a half, 2 years. And then by the time I think it became really clear that something different needed to happen after the debate, there was no real plan B. There was no other option. I think, so I guess I say that to say, I don't think there's a different way this could have developed after they put themselves in the position they put themselves in.
Got it.
But I do think there were different options. And so somehow I think the conversation has to start not just in what they could have done with Kamala Harris's message or what she can do individually to win these people back in the short term. I think the biggest thing they could have done is recognize that a lot of the country wanted a different direction or thought of the Democratic Party in a transitory period, and they ignored that evidence for way too long. That's all I'm saying.
Charlamagne, you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I agree with Astead 100%. I was a person that was calling for Joe Biden to step down, a year ago, 2 years ago, just because I knew that if we kept going the way that we was going, there was no possible way that, Joe Biden could win in November. And yeah, I think that he should have been a transitional president. Like, that should have been the plan, but it shouldn't have been just up to him. It should have been everybody around him should have known, like, hey, 2020, you're going to run, you're going to win, but you got to set up the next generation of Democrats. The only thing I would say is maybe 3-4 years ago, it didn't feel like Democrats had that strong of a bench. But now I remember Joe Biden said toward the end of last year, he was leaving one of the press conferences and they asked him, they said, who else can beat Trump except for you? And he turned around and he was like, there's about 50 of us that could beat Trump. And I was like, well, line them up. Because I felt like when he said that, it was true, right? I felt like Governor Shapiro. I felt like Gretchen Whitmer. I felt like, Wes Moore. I felt like the vice president, Kamala Harris. Like, I felt like there was people, who would have been more formidable opponents. So I think that the Democrats, they just didn't have a plan.
I think they had a bench, but the bench needed a lot of, I don't know, to use a sports metaphor, they needed a lot of practice and they needed to be in front of a national audience. And some of those people you just mentioned, Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, definitely Wes Moore, who I like, and I think he has a great political future, but they are very unproven on a national stage. So I'm not sure how strong the bench actually was. And I think part of the problem is what Astead was saying. They didn't have an opportunity to develop the bench because Joe Biden was so entrenched in the presidency. I thought we would talk about Kamala Harris as an interview subject because
Yeah.
that's something the three of us have in common. Astead, Charlamagne, and I have all interviewed the vice president, and I think we have different impressions. I was asking Charlamagne about Charla. I have a hard time calling you Charla, but I'll call you Charla. Charla, and he was saying he found her to be very disciplined, which made me smile because it's exactly what she said when you said something about her being scripted. I think she came back to you, Astead, in that 2019 interview and said, "No, I'm just disciplined." How do you think she's changed as a candidate? You've been watching her interviews. From your experience, do you think she's getting better, or is it all sort of remaining the same?
Yeah, I mean, there's been an evolution for sure. I remember meeting with, at that time, Senator Kamala Harris when she was getting ready to announce her presidential run a year into her kind of time in Washington. And I think it's just important to remember how different Democrats felt at that time. They was really kind of set between two poles, being Joe Biden's moderateness and Bernie Sanders' progressiveness. And there was a feeling for the folks who were sitting out in the middle that you kind of just had that the party was moving in an inevitably progressive direction. And so she did things at that time, like signing on the healthcare bill, single payer, like embracing some progressive stuff that she's obviously walked back. But I think it was an uncomfortable fit even at that time. Like, her record is one that has always suggested a hodgepodge of ideological ideas, a fluidity, and a desire to kind of, yes, reject some of the more rigid, particularly hard on crime stuff of the past, and also, kind of leading in a, I would say, more progressive direction, but it's never been the leftistness of San Francisco in the way that Republicans are describing. And so at the time, you could kind of feel the odd pairing that she was trying to do in that primary. And I don't think it really served them that well. So I remember, to answer your first question, like, I remember interviewing her initially, and you could kind of feel a candidate that was searching for the story they wanted to tell amid this like very intense Democratic landscape where Elizabeth Warren's putting out a plan every 5 minutes, and you got Pete Buttigieg doing an interview every day, right? Where do you find yourself in that was really, I think, fairly difficult. I think she found a lot more of her voice toward the end, when it was going worse, to be honest. That's when you have them say, she can be tough against Trump, or she was embracing the kind of prosecutor against a felon that I think they've arrived at. And it got her away from the progressive stuff. She was never going to be a fit for people who wanted Bernie Sanders to be a president. She was never going to be a fit for people who are more interested in war. And they kind of had to learn where that is. Interview wise, though, she doesn't. And I don't know how you all feel, but like, if you're asking for a vision, if you're asking for a root cause, if you're asking for, I think, some of the answers we expect from typical presidential candidates, it's never really the lane she wants to play in. I have not found her to be like particularly reflective on that front, or like an affirmative case to lay out where she stands on a lot of issues. But I do think she's true at is, executing a set play, talking about decision making, and being empathetic to a lot of different communities. And so it reminds me of a prosecutor in the way they come to issues, because it's oftentimes a reactive role, it's oftentimes an accountability role. It's not a vision setting role. And so sometimes I think in the interviews, you're feeling that tension, because the questions we're used to asking some of these candidates is, I don't think, really the lane she's existed foremost in. It's really a lawyer and a prosecutor, I think, more, and that's the foremost identities I've come to understand her through.
And maybe because she really deals with facts and evidence, I think she has a hard time being theoretical. And as you said, visionary.
That's not really her lane, I don't think.
I know, because, I really wanted to talk to her about the conundrum the Biden administration was finding itself in with Israel. And I said October 7th was horrible, horrific, unimaginable. The brutality, the barbarism that the world heard about. There are no words. Having said that, let's talk about where we are now. And I think it was last January, and, the Palestinian deaths were mounting. And I just wanted to give her permission to, and I asked her about how challenging this was, because it is the most complex and historically complicated situation there is. And instead of saying, picking up where I left off, she said, "Katie, let's talk about October 7th. And I was like, but I just basically did that.
Yeah.
But she seems, and so many interviews I've listened to, she does the same thing. And I think that's why people feel she's scripted, because she often answers questions the same way. And that's why I think, again, Charlotte, that they think that she relies on talking points, because you often hear the same points again and again and again. And but you found that to be discipline, not frustrating.
Well, yeah, because once she explained it in the last conversation we had, where she said, she has to be disciplined and you have to repeat things over and over and over and over in this era that we're in. I agree with that. And there is a double standard, because we act like Donald Trump doesn't do the same exact thing. Like Donald
Yeah.
Trump will repeat the same thing over and over, same rhetoric over and over. All politicians do that. Like I can't think of a politician who doesn't. I just think that we're in this news cycle in 2024 where we see every single conversation. We see the conversations when she's just talking locally to people in Pennsylvania, locally in Michigan, but then we see the big national conversations, and a lot of this rhetoric is the same. And I think it starts to become redundant to us. But the reality is, like, if you have a message that you're trying to get across to people and you're trying to nail these points, you are going to repeat yourself over and over.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. Go ahead, Astead.
I was just going to say, I think that's totally true. And certainly the comparison to Donald Trump isn't a fair one. Like, Trump doesn't answer anything and has often, even increasingly over the last 4 to 8 years, done less interviews, done less all of that type of stuff. The only thing I would say, and this is why, and I think some of this is based in my experience with her presidential campaign, is like I think Trump has told maybe bash me on this, but I think Trump has told a consistent story on the biggest issues that he cares about. Like, he's always been basically saying the same thing about immigration. He's always been basically saying the same thing about crime. And like, he has changed on 30, 40 other areas, but you kind of have a sense of the issues he cares the most about and the ways he would go about it. And one thing I think is different with Harris is the story of 2019, when she was introducing herself to a lot of the country, is not exactly the same place the party is now. And so I partly think that more than just individual interviews or policy or vision, we're really talking about those things as a proxy of how to get to know someone's true beliefs, what is motivating them, what they prioritize more than other stuff.
And so you don't think she's done that well?
And I don't think it's been consistent enough for people to really grab onto. Like, I know that because the voters I talk to still feel like they haven't heard. And it's not because she hasn't done enough interviews, I don't think. It's not because she hasn't. I just think there hasn't been the story that you started with and the story you've landed with. There's still some distance there that has not been explained, in my opinion.
Well, I think one thing that we have to keep in mind too, we're talking about, 100 days of Vice President Kamala Harris running for president versus 12 years of Donald Trump running for president. So of course we know all Donald Trump's messaging. Of course we know where he stands on the biggest issues. She hasn't even had a chance to, create that type of campaign for herself. Like, when she ran in 2020, she was only here for a split second. Then she became vice president and had to play that role, so we didn't hear from her at all. Now you got 100 days or however long it was to tell the American people what it is you're about, versus, going against someone for 12 years. And to your point about what you said, about where she stood in 2019 versus now is much different. And we all admit that the Democratic Party was out of their goddamn mind in 2019.
I think that's an important point.
Like, I'm so glad that she's more of a centrist. I really am. Like, I think that the right was too far this way, the left was too far this way. I'm glad we got somebody that's just in the middle. That's what we need to be.
Because that's all what I'm saying is that is a story that she could tell. And I can say in my experience, when I have asked what has changed, then from there, and you can say, looking back, I think the party went too far in one direction, and I think people would hear that for sure.
But don't you think they're afraid to alienate progressives?
To make that clear.
Don't you think that she'd be afraid to alienate progressives if she said something like that instead?
I think that's probably true, but her final message is campaigning with Liz Cheney in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. She's already basically done it. The thing she's made most clear over the last couple months to answer what are the differences between you and Biden question are basically that she's more of a centrist. She's more of a moderate. And so I think she's basically doing it. She's just not making it clear. And I think that's a messaging choice that we've seen from the campaign even before she was the nominee. There's clearly a desire to be everything to everyone because they want to recreate, I think, an anti-Trump. They don't want to break up the anti-Trump coalition. I just think at that point, then you're ceding some points on the vision scale too. And
I wanted,
so that's
I
the only
want,
thing. That's the choice I think they're making.
I wanted to ask you all about her having to define herself in 100 days. I just wish that she had been more forward facing or public facing during her years as vice president. And
I guess.
I think Joe Biden's hesitancy to do interviews, to get out there, to do unscripted moments really hurt her because she was sort of in the witness protection program for 4 years.
Yes, that was my biggest critique of her. When I made a statement one time that I felt I was disappointed, and I had a little bit of regret, voting for that ticket. Not that I would have voted for Trump, but I just was like, damn, I don't know if I could do this again come November. And I don't know if that means I would, sit out. No, I wouldn't have sat out. I would have voted, but I just wasn't willing to endorse. I wasn't going to tell people, hey, I'm voting for President Biden. But that was my biggest critique of her. My biggest critique of her was like, man, I voted for this ticket because of you. And because I thought Joe Biden was going to be a transitional president. I thought that even though we know what the role of vice president traditionally has been, because you're a woman, because you're a woman of color, because you can speak to a lot of things in this moment that he can't, I just thought she would have been, like you said, Ms. Couric, a little bit more front facing. And when I didn't get that, I was disappointed. But I think I personally had a unrealistic expectation of what I expected from her.
All I'm saying is I don't think that was unrealistic. I
Okay.
think they pretty clearly implied that to most Americans in 2020. Like, I think age was a big concern about Joe Biden in the primary when he was running 4 years ago. And they made those statements about transitional president, about signaling one term, her selection. I remember what the campaign was telling reporters on background. They set up the idea that you should think about this as a two-person ticket and that the future would flow through, at least start with the Kamala Harris, right? And so I just think, I don't think the plan that would have changed some of this stuff is all that mysterious. I just think they backed off of it. And for my reporting, it was pretty clear that in the first couple years of Harris, there was some stuff about her stepping back from media, particularly after the Lester Holt interview. But much more important was a White House that was trying to insulate Joe Biden. And so I do think, to your point, Katie, like, she was a victim somewhat of that strategy because they created this adversarial media relationship that I never understood. Like, but it's okay probably for Biden, who has such a brand in the country and people have a sense that they know. I think it matters more for someone like Harris where that is not as defined.
And it didn't help that there was so much negative stories coming out of the White House about her, and a lot of that was from the administration. There was people in the administration who was putting out these sort of hit pieces about her and saying how she has aspirations beyond being vice president, and so what? She can't keep anybody on her staff.
Right. You think that? So why would the administration do that, you guys? Why would that? I mean, just because they were being assholes? I mean, or were they threatened by him or by her? Why would the administration do something like that? Put out all these bad stories.
I think somebody was scared of a potential president, Kamala Harris.
Yeah,
Like, that's what I can think of.
I think it's a fair read. I would say that the tensions between president and vice president are there's often those tensions, right? But this one was different. I think partially because you had the looming question of age. And the White House's strategy was to deny that was a real problem, not just amongst, but in the country, or that was not a real Biden liability. And so it was coming from the White House and administration to say that Joe Biden is the only person who can beat Donald Trump, that Joe Biden is the only one who, and so some of that stuff, I remember, I'll tell you an actual story. I remember one time talking to this White House official and saying, okay, I was building my profile of Harris that we were doing in the Times Magazine last year. And one thing I had heard was that they had seen some data that said when she goes out and delivers messages specifically on abortion, they get big movement among independents. So I'm running this past the White House, and the way that you think they would support because it's their vice president. And the thing the person told me was actually, it's like, hey, that's not specific to her. That's anybody who gives the Biden message. And that is the type of weirdo relationship I'm talking about. Because on one hand, you would think that they would see her as a valuable asset,
Right.
because their incentive, and I think this is like how some of those White House ambitions work, is to insulate their own candidate. Sometimes that comes at the expense even of other Democrats.
Well, during that profile, I know that you said you felt like you were on trial when you were interviewing her. I want to play a short clip of the interview you did with her, and you can talk about it after we listen to it.
Another thing in 2020 was obviously those things were happening at the time that Biden was making his selection for running mate. And I was reading stories at that time that was basically saying very clearly, the Times story, Harry Reid says that, he came to the decision that he needed to choose a black woman. While that is obviously about you, that's not necessarily you personally, but your identity. How should it matter? Does it matter that narrative has existed, that Biden needed to choose someone who was a black person? And should it matter?
I don't think I understand your question.
I'm saying, does it matter that kind of narrative around Biden needed to choose a black woman as a running mate still exists and has hovered over that selection? Or
it happened. I don't think I understand you. I honestly don't understand your question.
I'm saying, did that put
Has
you in
it lingered?
Yeah, did that
He chose a black woman. That woman is me. So I don't know that anything lingers about what he should choose. He has chosen. He asked me to join him on the ticket.
I guess I can move on.
I just gave up.
She wasn't picking up what you were putting down, Astead.
Also, she knows good and well what I'm talking about. I know she knows what I'm talking about. I should know, and it's fine. I think it's okay. I think this is my point about sometimes, in the same way I think Charlamagne's right that like she wants someone to say the thing that she maybe doesn't want to say. She also doesn't want to be put in the position, I think sometimes journalists do more often, of like respond to the thing you don't want to respond to, right? And so I think that the whole time I was doing that story, I heard so much about how the diversity hireness of it all, unfair or, whatever, was still part of the reason people were kind of invalidating her selection. And I think minimizing the prospect that she could be the eventual leader of the Democratic Party. And so you would talk to Democrats about what happens after Joe Biden, and they wouldn't even include Kamala Harris in the picture. And that was informing so many of those questions at the time, is because it seemed very clear that some of this was really tied to what was a subtle dismissing of her role. And I think what I wanted to do in that is put it in front of her to respond to. And I think that there is somewhat a racism. I think there's a subtle way that discrimination works, where particularly in political media, people have these kind of silent, anonymous conversations around you, and they won't give you the dignity of saying, this is what I think about that. And so I thought, okay, she would appreciate being able to be like, this is ridiculous, blah, 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 or whatever she wants to say. But that's a critical misunderstanding of Kamala Harris that I made, because I don't think she wants to do that. And frankly, I think she found it insulting to bring it up to her.
I think you pointed out that she's not particularly introspective, right?
Not in that way. She's not going to do it with you. I think she does it with some other people. She's not going to do it with me. She's not going to do it in that type of setting.
Yeah, and I also think that, man, if there's anything that was like, I don't want to say conflict, right? Because I don't know if you remember, Astead, but there was he didn't just pick the vice president. Like there was a huge deal. There was a lot of tension, right?
Petitions, front room convo, back room convo.
Yes, they did a big write up in USA Today where it was like Angela Rye and Sunny Hostin and all of these different black women who were demanding you need to pick a black woman as your running mate. And there was a lot of pushback on that because there was all of these rumors about, I don't think the first lady or at the time Joe Biden didn't necessarily like Kamala, or a lot of people around Biden didn't like Kamala because of the way Kamala came at Joe Biden during the debate. So
wasn't it all James Clyburn, you guys? Wasn't it James Clyburn?
No, Mr. Clyburn wanted a Supreme Court justice.
He did not care about the VP. Yes, you're
right.
He
did not. Mr. Clyburn did not care about the VP. Mr. Clyburn was like, you need a black woman Supreme Court judge.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Was that misreported, Astead, for a long time?
I
I think it
I
was
think
right.
people have overinflated Clyburn's role a little bit. I think the mythology post South Carolina primary has become very large, but he's really clear about this, and he's been clear about this from the jump.
That's
He
right.
did not say you need to choose Kamala Harris. He said he wanted his Supreme Court justice, and he got
Right.
it, right? Like,
Right.
but he was not. It was a big campaign discussion. To your point, like they basically had an internal fight among the Biden campaign of whether they had to choose a black woman, and there were people on multiple sides of that fight. But the truth is that Harris was the only one who was qualified in a non-race way, and also sufficed this kind of racial conversation that was happening too, right? So I don't think it was just identity. I don't think it was only that. But I do think it played a huge role. And particularly at that time when we had the post-Floyd moment. And so I think to your point about 2020 seeming kind of crazy, like the fact that this happened so publicly was so unique anyway. And so that was part of the reason I was bringing those questions to her, is because I know that conversation reached her. I know that even the kind of backlash to that reached her too. And so the difference is she does not want that. And other people said it. There were people in the story who were like, I think that they have, pigeonholed her and blah, 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 blah. But she doesn't want that to come from her. And I partially understand that. I just want something that's not the type of adversariness that then acts like you're crazy for asking it.
Dana Bash, I remember this vividly. Dana Bash was interviewing President Biden. They looked like they were outside somewhere. And Dana Bash said to him, Charlamagne and a host of others say you have to choose a black woman as a running mate. And Joe goes, well, Jim Clyburn says I don't. I remember it. So this happened on CNN. So these conversations were happening everywhere. This is a fact.
You think she's improved in her interviews, Astead?
I do. I think she's done more of them. And so I think doing more is usually better. And seeing it not as an attempt to like seeing it, there's multiple ways for politicians to think about interviews, but the best strategy I've learned is when they see it as an opportunity to get their message across. And I think there's been a change in thinking a little bit, but I have to also say they've changed the type of people they talk to. And that's been a big difference in the last 4 years too. Like I don't think they're like, anti-New York Times or mainstream media, kind of incentive, or, the message they've been doing to kind of pull them away from that type of stuff is an accident. I think they prefer talking to people who are more explicitly supportive. You can have more intimate conversations. I know podcasting and that stuff. I'm not saying like that stuff is bad. I'm just saying it's kind of been zero sum, where they've done more interviews with people who support them, have they done less with more traditional media. And partially, I think we have underrated the intentionality of that. That has not been something, yeah.
Does that help them? Because to me, I think people are craving not necessarily a Brett Baier interview, but and I think Charlamagne did ask some really good questions during his interview.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not talking about the quality of questions. I think that interview is good. I'm saying that they're choosing the places really specifically.
But what do you think that these questions they're appealing to different groups, like the Call Her Daddy podcast and the Breakfast Club podcast? Obviously, she knows that there are a lot of black male listeners for the Breakfast Club, so it seems like they're really being very intentional about reaching a certain audience. At the same time, do you think it's hurt her not doing an interview with a fair-minded but tough traditional journalist who will really kind of go through some of the issues, not talk over her, not feel like they're reading Donald Trump's talking points, what Brett Baier kind of felt like, but somebody who really asks some really well-crafted, well thought out questions? You don't think that's hurt her, you guys?
I think she might need one big prime time interview.
Well, she did 60 Minutes with Bill Whitaker.
She did. I'm gonna be honest with you. No disrespect to 60 Minutes. I hate how they do interviews. I can't stand when they narrate, when they ask the question, then narrate the answer. I cannot stand that. It drives me crazy. But I think she needs to do one big prime time conversation for America from a traditional journalist. I do agree that would help a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's just a matter, and to me, it's like not just going there, but what are they willing to say when they're there, right? Like, and I think that, the second the switch happened, the overall question in my head is, are we still talking about a Joe Biden second term with the new person at the top? Or is there something different about Kamala Harris that they want to lay out and make a different type of break from the administration or embrace a kind of change mantle more? And they've slowly gotten around to doing some breaks with the administration, but it's been really small. And I think that's the question I really have that I think a more traditional interview would really lay out is to the point about the vision question. What is that? And what is the differences between that and what your just generic Democrat would be?
Well, she famously said on The View that she couldn't think of anything that she would have done differently in the Biden administration. She did say to Brett Baier, I am not Joe Biden. I'm a different person. I'll bring my life experiences, my professional background, yada, yada, yada. But she still didn't really, I don't think, crystallize how they differ. And do you think that's because she didn't want to offend Joe Biden? I read somewhere that he kind of gave her permission to say, yes, it's okay. You can separate yourself from my agenda or my administration. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I saw her say in a different time when she was asked this question, I think a couple days ago, traditionally vice presidents don't criticize the president. All I would say to Democrats is like, that sort of deference is part of the reason they have got themselves in the first place. Like, their inability to see this administration as unpopular is a big problem. And so they can keep pretending as if people don't have those feelings about the administration. And then I think their play is basically an anti-Trump one, which might work. Or they have to acknowledge that some of that is in the air. And then it becomes more important to lay out what those differences might be. And so to your point, I haven't seen that become clear. But I think that's downstream of a bigger problem I think they're facing, which is that they have not really come to terms with the fact that they cannot just be the Biden administration and tell people that's okay. For as much as they want to tell people the economy's better in the numbers than you might feel, for much as they want to say, Gaza would be worse under Trump, so get over it. That's not really working with those people. And so they keep going back to that well. I just think it's kind of a risky one to do because the kind of lecture strategy, see Obama with black men a week or two ago, I don't think that's a winning one.
Well, let's talk about that. Go ahead.
There were two places that I feel like she could really break away from Biden. She's doing one of them where she talks about her opportunity economy, like when she talks about rebuilding the middle class, when she talks about wanting to provide people with the opportunity to own a small business, own a home. I think speaking directly to that, directly rebuilding the middle class, I think that could be something she could break away from Biden with, and talking about how. You have these conversations about the middle class. When we was in Detroit, my man E.T. Eric, he said something to her. I hear all of this talk about the middle class, but how do we get people from poverty into the middle class? That could be a way to break away. And another way to break away is to simply say, hey, man, I feel like, this administration got a lot wrong with the border. Yeah. And it's going to take bipartisan legislation to fix the border. The border has been a problem under a lot of different administrations. So, Democrats, Republicans, we're going to have to come together and fix this. And guess what? We did have a bill that, Democrats agreed on and Republicans agreed on, but Trump shot it down because he didn't want us to get any political wins. But she should speak to that. She should really say, hey, we got it. We didn't get it right on the border. Yeah. This administration didn't get it right. I'm not the president. I'm the vice president, so I'm just, riding with my guy, but I don't think we got it all the way right on the border. I'm going to be stronger.
Why do you think she doesn't? Why doesn't she do that?
Because politicians just don't want to admit they're wrong. Politicians don't want to admit, because if I admit I was wrong on the border, then that means the Republicans were right, so that gives them a political win, so to speak. It's just that simple. They don't want to admit that they got it wrong.
I think those are all great options that she has in front of her in terms of making a more explicit break. And I think it is just that kind of simple. And it goes back to something I said earlier, though. This one, I think they kind of politics galaxy brain themselves out of doing the obvious thing. It's because the Democrats are already kind of conceding the Trump point that the border's a problem. It's clear in their ads. It's clear in how they talk. They've done a 180 from how they talk about the border from 4 years ago when they were running. And so all I'm saying is that it's already there. What's not there is a clear explanation of how you transition or where you find yourself in that. And so some of that is a leadership question. I would much rather be the person driving my party shifts in an election than the person feeling like I was just a weather vane and I'm flowing wherever the party's going. And so some of that is what I think they have to get comfortable in stepping into. And I just think at this point, they're just going to roll the dice with the election and kind of anti-Trumpness and call it a day. But like in the end, the question for her will be, what does the party look like under you? And there's no way to avoid that, you know? Like, so when I hear like, even when I hear something like a bipartisan council of advisors with Republicans, yeah, I think that does the signaling to the Liz Cheney types that you're open to more centrist ideas. But I also hear someone who's, again, ceding the vision question to other people. And I'm like, I don't think that really solves the biggest problem. I don't think people don't think you listen. I think people want to know what you believe, you know? And so I think that's a slight difference that they're not necessarily playing in right now. And I really think the answer is because they don't want those beliefs to turn off the type of people who they can keep in line if it's just about beating Trump.
You know, that was a question I had for her
Yeah.
that I didn't get to because I only had an hour. But it's like, do black people of color who run for president, do they have to say we're going to have Republicans in our cabinet just to appease America?
That's a great question.
There's a certain sector of white America that people of color, when they are, because President Obama did it, now she's doing it. Do y'all have to do that just to appease?
Is it just black candidates who have said that in the past? I don't think so. I think other candidates.
But I do think identity plays a big piece here because I think, like, think about how many times Obama made a point to clarify he just won't be the president of Black America. Yeah. Like, I think that there is something, and the opposite is true too. Biden was free to talk about black people all the time. You know, like Biden made clear, I will do things specifically for black communities in a way that I think black politicians sometimes scare away from. And I also think his brand as moderate, yes, it's true it's true because he's been there for a long time. But I also think white manness allows you to pass some of those electability concerns. You know, a story I will tell about Harris specific to this point. Do you remember the second debate? You know, the first debate's the one she came at Biden about segregation and busing.
Right.
But the second debate, she was kind of a different person.
Yes.
And it felt really Jekyll Hyde from the person you met in the first debate. And I remember asking one of her advisors, like, whoa, what was up with that? Like, what was the decision process there? And the answer I remember getting was, we didn't want her to feel too much like a hard charging or angry black woman. And so partly it was about show some different sides of yourself. And this is some white guy telling me, you know, classic dim consultant type. Yeah. And I think, like, on one hand, you see why that is the advice, but you're also pulling someone away from who they are. Like, I think Kamala Harris is a fairly direct, fairly hard-charging black woman, and that's fine. Like, that's the appeal, you know? Like,
right.
That is,
to me, that's when she's at her best.
That's when you understand her the most. Like, that's when it's clear. So I think partly there is these ways they tell themselves women, black people have to operate. And I'm like, is that rule true? Or if she is just who she is, then do people pick up on that? And that matters more.
She's a
so
prosecutor.
It's how you position yourself. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, she's a prosecutor. She's a person who used to hold people accountable in those Senate hearings. Yeah. When I watched her with Brett Baier, when she gets angry, she's like, all right, yo, Brett, cut that out. Like, we're not doing that. When I had her on my TV show and I was saying to her, like, who is the real president? Is it Joe Manchin or is it Joe Biden? She was like, Charlamagne, cut it out.
Yes.
Stop talking like a Republican. President Biden is the president, and I'm Kamala Harris, the vice president. Like, she's at her best when the fire is lit.
When she's roasting me, I think you get it more, even in the interview, right? Like, I'm saying, like, it's who I think. And so sometimes I think I particularly learned this covering her and Warren in the last primary. There's often these people in the back room that have decided who these people have to be. And I think, particularly among Democrats in the post-Trump era, I just think that, like, being what is most true matters more. And, like, if you're up against Donald Trump, who's going to be himself every day of the week and lose on that front too, I think inauthenticity is a much bigger risk than they acknowledge. And some of that stuff I do think is really tied to identity, blackness and sexism.
You know, my sister was running for governor of Virginia and she got sick and had to drop out. And I remember her saying to me, when you run for office, you have to be willing to lose. And I think what she meant was you have to adhere to some North Star. You have to be who you are through and through. And I think you're right, Astead. I think that authenticity, you can smell inauthenticity a mile away. So I think there is something that has felt slightly amorphous of who she really is deep down inside.
And I guess I don't think she's in confusion about that, by the way. Like, I think this is actually about how you present and how you tell that story through politics and policy. Like, I think she knows who she is.
Yeah.
It's about translating that into a way that people can most understand. I remember learning that, advisors had asked her, did she want to call herself a pragmatic progressive? Right? Like, is there a way that you can distill something so that people can have a sense of understanding how you make decisions? That is what I think is the thing we're talking about.
I was just going to mention the narrative over the past few weeks, and this is something Charlamagne has weighed into, and I wanted your view on this, is she's struggling with Black men, particularly under the age of 50. Charlamagne said he thought that was an unfair assessment, that some Black folks in the United States are struggling more with the Democratic Party than with Kamala Harris. So I'd love to hear your take on the kind of latest hair on fire issue in Democratic circles.
Yeah, and I would love to hear you on this also, Charlamagne. I mean, I think that what you said, I definitely agree with. I think it's part of a broader story that's much more about Black people's relationship with the Democratic Party than it is about individual Black men and Kamala Harris. Even if you look at the numbers, post 2012, we've seen a consistent decline of Black share of support for Democrats. Even if you look at 2022, where Democrats did really well, Black turnout was their weakest point. It's their widest coalition yet. And they've actually, as the party has got more college educated and things, like, they take on different types of issues. And so I don't think it's any surprise that if you have politicians that increasingly come from a more college educated lens, if you take on issues, even if your way you're appealing to Black folks is representation, which is often about elite Black folks in elite spaces, that pulls you further and further away from the type of Black folks we're talking about who feel distant from the party. I remember we did an episode about this at my family Thanksgiving table last year for the podcast, and I pulled together a whole bunch of family and friends. We talked about the kind of shadow of Obama, because I'm from Chicago, and how that led to this kind of feeling of difference with Democrats. And one thing that I think stuck out is, like, when you ask people, why are you a Democrat in the first place? The answer that I got was much more about their fight for poor people than it was they fight for Black people. And I think that's an important thing to remember for a lot of these people, is like the drop off is partially because the brand has gotten further away from we fight for poor people. And it overlaps that includes a bunch of Black men that includes a certain share of these folks. But I think to say that it's just sexism, or it's just a white husband, or it's just excuses, to not have a Black woman president, I really think is a type of tone. And I think particularly, I think about what Obama said, there's no way he would go to white communities and make that same type of lecturing argument. He wouldn't go to his cousins in Kansas and say, it's your fault. He would say, what are your concerns? And how is the party speaking to that? And I just think it's not that hard. That's what folks are looking for.
Charlamagne, I'll call you Charlotte if you call me Katie, and you don't have to call me Miss Couric. But you did ask Vice President Harris on your show about what Barack Obama said in that more intimate setting when he seemed like he was scolding Black men for not supporting her. Let's listen to that.
President Obama was out there last week waving his finger at Black men. When are Liz Cheney and Hillary Clinton going to wave their finger at white women? When are Bill Clinton and Joe Biden going to wave their finger at white men? Because 52% of white women voted for Trump in 2016. 55% voted for Trump in 2020. They all voted against their own interests. When the finger waving going to start at them?
Well, thank you for highlighting that. I do have the support of over 200 Republicans who worked for various administrations including everyone going back to Ronald Reagan, to the Bushes, to John McCain and Mitt Romney, and including Liz Cheney. And I'm very proud to have her support. And I believe that many of them who may have voted for Trump before are supporting me because they know the stakes are so high in terms of our very democracy and rule of law. And
so the finger wagging should start today or tomorrow.
Well, I think what is happening is that we are all working on reminding people of what is at stake, and that is very important.
So, what did you think about the way she answered that question?
I mean, she didn't answer my question directly, but you know what I think. What I think the VP likes to do is she likes for me just to say things because she know it'll be out in it. She knows somebody. She knows somebody will hear it. So it's just like, you know, me saying it right there in that moment in front of her. Liz Cheney will hear it. Hillary will hear it. Bill Clinton will hear it. Joe Biden will hear it. And it's just like, yeah, you know what? We do need to be out here, you know, rallying people that look like us to go out there and support her.
I think it's the difference between saying the words Black people are not a monolith and truly believing it, right? And truly operating from that front. I mean, this pops up in other ways too, we should point out. Like part of the Black folks drifting to Trump, if you look at places like Florida, are a bunch of first generation African Americans who have different immigrant experience, different life experience than the voting bloc that's traditionally had a bunch of roots in America. And I think has a different lens on politics than your more African American Southern core. So I'm like, if you actually think about the differences that are true among Black people broadly, then of course there's drop off on some areas. Of course, some of these things interact differently. But I would only say that Obama has shown a consistent tone of lecturing over the years. Like he did this while president, talking about your cousin Pookie and pull up your pants and things like that. And so I think like it's just one of those things where, you know, I talked to Governor Westmore about Black men specifically. And what he says is you need to acknowledge their frustration with the political system and the role that Democrats have played in that. And that's where you got to start. And
I was going to say how can they win them back?
And I think that's where you got to start from. I think it's a lens on issues, but I also think it is a tone that acknowledges frustration with the political system and frustration with the Democratic Party. Like it is not even if 70-80% of Black folks vote for Democrats, when you talk to them, they have a lot of problems with the Democratic Party. And so I think when folks act as if it's not a thing that I think when folks act like Black folks are just mindlessly hitting the blue button, that's when you don't see the type of nuances that can lead you to make those marginal improvements.
You know, Ms. Couric, I quoted this earlier, but I want to read the exact quote. You know, this is from President Obama's speech. It wasn't when he was talking in the more intimate setting. It was when he was talking at the rally in Pennsylvania. And he said, and so sometimes the other excuse we hear when we're talking to folks is, well, it ain't going to make no difference. Well, no, you're right that we're not eliminating poverty. We're not going to get rid of all problems with race. We're not going to prevent every bad thing from happening in this country. Whoever we elect president, that's not how things work. The question is, do we have somebody there who sees us, who cares about us, who will work on our behalf and can make things a little bit better? And so there were a whole bunch of things that I did not get done when I was president after 8 years. I couldn't do it because it was blocked by Congress, couldn't do it because sometimes the Supreme Court stepped in, couldn't do it because I couldn't persuade enough folks to do it. This is how you get Black men back. This is how you get Black people back. Because there's a level of honesty in this statement and an empathy to what voters are feeling that you're speaking directly to. You don't got to get up there, Mr. President Obama, and tell me about all of this hope and change that we can believe in, and you know how you're going to wave a wand and you know to change the conditions of the Black community. No, I know you can't eliminate poverty. I know you're not going to get rid of all the problems with race, but I also convince me that you care and you will work on my behalf to make things better. That's the messaging. That should be the messaging of the Democratic Party.
And it can't come this late. To be honest, they have said they understood this. They were investing early, but the reality is, come the midterms, the last 4 years, there have been signs about this with Black folks for a while. And so the fact that I think this conversation has only recently developed is already emblematic of a problem, because it could have been a thing that they invested in early. And I think to the point about the primary early, these are the type of things that the primary would do, is talk about how to have a conversation about how they talk to Black men in the first place. In that interview with Harris last year, I asked her, the party talks more about race and blackness than before. Why isn't that leading to more black votes? And her answer, was ask me after 2024, which I think is the same type of dismissiveness of the problem that we've kind of seen from them. And so 2024 might end up being the wake up call on this front, but I don't think it's limited to black people. There's a Latino men problem. There's a young man.
There's also a blue collar, non-college educated white man
I'm saying
problem.
like it is a broader thing. And so I the specificness of black men somewhat feels like an early attempt to blame a loss, in my opinion. I'm like, if Kamala Harris was to lose, first, the reason will not chiefly be black men. And so I don't get why sometimes the conversation has felt like that.
Before we go, and you guys have been so generous with your time, this podcast is going to drop when there's less than 2 weeks to go before the election. And I know that, Astead, you've been traveling like crazy. You've qualified for the Delta Diamond Medallion. You've been crisscrossing the country. I think Charlamagne and I would both like to hear what you're hearing as you travel all across America. What are some of the things that are really sticking out in your mind?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is before the switch happened, so much of what we heard was an apathetic relationship to this presidential race and a frankly downright hostile feeling of being forced to be choose between those two candidates. And for a year or so, that was the overwhelming kind of malaise in the air, was why do I want to deal with this election? And that was driven. And I think for a lot of people, we were talking to Democrats, they were saying, oh, well, we have to deal with kind of getting people invested, but they weren't recognizing their own, that they were part of that problem because of the candidates. Since the switches happened, there has been a greater willingness to kind of like engage in the election and things like that. But I think we're still basically dealing with the landscape in which Trump is the main figure, partially Democrats' own making and kind of messaging. But it feels like a referendum on him. And one thing that Republicans have done from 4 years ago to now is get their voters on the same page when it comes to things like early voting, when it comes to things like participating, and they use election denial in that message. So we were in Georgia last week, and we are hearing people voting, lined up to vote on the first day of early voting where they broke records. And they're saying the reason is because Dominion stole the machines last year. They're using the Donald Trump language of denial as a motivation to go vote. And so it has this kind of dual effect where I think it's created a more unified MAGA base, but we're still going to deal with the situation. Whereas some guy told me in Georgia, if Donald Trump doesn't win, I don't believe it. I think those questions are still hugely important. From a Democratic side, I think they have a good chance to do fine. It's just with a little bit of a different base and coalition than they like to admit. The Obama days are done. Like it's a little wider, it's a little more college educated, it's a little more affluent, it's a little, and all of that type of stuff. I think it's just things that are uncomfortable for them to say out loud. But the people who wanted to protect democracy and protect abortion rights are really real. And you see that all across, folks. And so without those issues, I think Donald Trump has correctly named people's desire for change from this administration. But I think Donald Trump is a huge liability for being the messenger of that. And so that's how you get to 50-50. And I think that's been really clear in the different parts of the country. If you go to Georgia and Arizona, we hear so much more about immigration. We hear so much more about, I think, issues that play well for Donald Trump. But when we're in Michigan and Wisconsin and hearing about abortion rights and protecting democracy, you see how there's still a path for Harris. And I just think that the party itself, Democrats specifically, haven't had a what we believe in adult combo since 2019. And so without that, in the absence of that, what they believe in is just Donald Trump shouldn't be president again. And so that's what this has come to be, but it's ground that they ceded because the other conversation, the uncomfortable conversation, was one they weren't willing to have last year.
Any final thoughts? That
Okay.
did. Any final thoughts, Charlamagne, before we go?
No, I agree with everything Astead just said. Before there was a VP Harris at the top of the ticket, I was saying that this election is going to boil down to the criminals who are the Republicans, the cowards who are the Democrats because they don't fight hard enough on nothing, and the couch, which is vote apathy. And I think, those people on the couch, they were totally checked out. When she got to the top of the ticket, Now they're sitting up on the couch a little bit, like, oh, let me see what's going on. They're listening, and they're listening to, hear things that, they can resonate with. And it's really just up to the Democratic Party over the next couple of weeks. It's up to VP Kamala Harris to go out there and give them something, to get up and go to that voting booth for. I think Democrats, they do a terrible job of talking about people they never truly talk to. And I think that they have a real disconnect with working class people in America, not just working class black people either, working class people, period. I think that there's a level of elitism that has happened in the Democratic Party, even when they say things like the economy is great. Look at the stock market. The people I'm talking to, where I'm from, in rural Moncks Corner, in a rural area in South Carolina, they don't know nothing about no stocks. They don't have no stocks. They don't care about that. They want to know about the grocery prices, those rent prices.
Yep.
That's what they're talking about. They're talking about the cost of whiting being too high.
Yep.
And Democrats got to find a way to get back into the trenches and start talking to people instead of talking about people. And when they get that connection again with the working class, I think they'll be in a much better place.
I think the only thing I would add to that is so much of that disconnect, I think, has been driven by a bad assumption that the racial changes, the demographic changes in the country would just inevitably lead to more Democratic votes. I think they're still breaking themselves from that demographic destiny belief. And so more Latinos does not mean inherently more Democrats. That is a misunderstanding of the diversity of that community. More black folks does not inherently mean more Democrats. That's not an understanding. Yeah, and so I'm an Asian voter. We can keep going down the line, but I think the missing piece for people's understanding is really just an assumption that folks had. One, that Donald Trump would just be invalidated either by January 6th or the legal cases, or that something would happen by himself. And then the second piece, I think, is they still have to break themselves from the assumption that all these minority folks will inevitably move in their direction. And so whatever the new demographic version of America is, there's no telling what that means politically, And I think they are just getting to that understanding. And some of the shifts, particularly on the class front we're talking about, have forced that recognition.
Astead Herndon and Charlamagne the God. This was so fun. Thank you both for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Miss Katie. I'll just say Katie. Katie.
Yeah, Miss Katie's fine.
Okay.
So Southern and cute.
No, thank y'all for having it. Love the work that y'all do. So happy to be here.
Oh, thank you
Thank
all.
you very much.
See you soon.
Yeah, see
All right.
you.
Bye.